I moved into my new apartment 3 years ago, thinking I'd finally found a quiet little corner of the city. The kind of place where you could make coffee in peace, read a book without interruptions, and maybe even wave at a neighbor without wanting to roll your eyes. But within the first week, I met him. Let's call him Dave. Dave had the energy of a toddler on espresso, mixed with the emotional intelligence of a raccoon in a library. He banged doors at 7 a.m., left trash in the hallway, and somehow managed to play the most obnoxious music I'd ever heard at all hours. Not jazz, not classical. No, it was this weird hybrid of heavy metal, and I don't even know. It was a sound that made your stomach tighten and your head ache simultaneously. I smiled at first. Maybe he's just settling in, I thought. But then the notes hit me at 6:30 a.m. right through the thin walls. That's when I realized, no, he was not settling in. He was occupying my life. I tried patience, I really did. I knocked politely on his door once, tried subtle hints about noise, and even left a friendly note. Hey, hope you're doing well. Maybe a little lower volume in the mornings? Thanks. He smiled. He laughed. And then cranked the music up the next day. Something shifted. That's when the tiny seed of quiet resentment started growing. Not hatred, not rage, just irritation. But it didn't stay small, not for long. It grew slowly, quietly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. I started noticing all the little things. The way he left his garbage in the hallway. The way he had friends over at midnight and shouted across the hall. The way he made it impossible to have peace anywhere in my own apartment. And in my quieter moments, I caught myself thinking, what would happen if he got a taste of his own medicine? I pushed the thought away. I told myself I was better than that. But that thought, once planted, never dies. It just waits. It waits for the right time. Weeks passed. I started keeping a notebook, not a grudge journal, just observations. Which days he played music. Which hours he left trash. When he had parties, when he argued with friends, when he laughed too loudly. It felt ridiculous, even as I did it. But there's a peculiar clarity in documenting patterns. By the third month, I could predict almost every single obnoxious move Dave would make. I knew when he would be loud, when he would be annoying, when he would ruin my carefully structured day. And with that knowledge came something new, control. I wasn't helpless anymore. I was planning. I didn't call it revenge yet, not openly, not consciously. I just called it preparation. Because patience, I realized, was the first weapon. And the best revenge I've heard is subtle, intelligent human, not violent, not explosive, not criminal, just perfectly timed. And I was learning how to wait. Then one day, I discovered something about Dave that I hadn't expected. Something that changed the way I saw him and the way my little plan might unfold. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. One Thursday morning, as I was sipping my coffee by the window, I noticed Dave struggling with his bicycle. Now, this might sound trivial, but something about the way he flailed, muttering to himself in frustration while trying to get the chain back on, struck me in a way I didn't expect. I should have felt sympathy, I really should have. But instead, I smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a triumphant one, more like the quiet recognition of opportunity. It hit me, if life gave me a chance to mirror his chaos back to him, subtly, cleverly, I might finally find some justice. Not loud justice, not dramatic, not the sort that makes headlines. Just perfect, patient human revenge. For days, I watched carefully. I mapped his routines. I noticed things no casual observer would. He never locked his door when he left. He had a particular pattern for when he'd blast music, mostly during the early evening hours. He was obsessive about his garden, watering at exactly 7:15 a.m. like clockwork. Every detail mattered. Every tiny quirk was a thread I could pull. I started small, harmlessly small. At first, it was just a misplaced object here, a subtle rearrangement there. Nothing overt, nothing anyone else would notice. One evening, after a particularly loud session of guitar practice, I slipped a small sticky note under his door. "Dear Dave, the walls aren't soundproof. Love, your downstairs friend." I expected him to be angry, maybe yell, maybe confront me. But he just laughed, out loud, and then cranked the music even louder. That's when I realized subtle humor alone wouldn't cut it. I needed patience, timing, precision. So I went deeper. I observed his patterns even more closely. His friends, his habits, his little annoyances, the things that irked him, often the very same things he inflicted on me. And I started imagining scenarios. Little nudges, little inconveniences. The kind of frustration that builds slowly, almost imperceptibly. Not mean, not cruel, not illegal, just poetic. And with each passing day, I could feel it forming, the plan. It started to take shape in my mind like a puzzle. A small smile forming at the edges of my mouth each time I thought about it. I could hear my own internal voice saying, "Patience, wait for the right moment." I even began timing his music sessions down to the minute, tracking his comings and goings. Little observations no one would think mattered. And yet, everything mattered. It became more than annoyance, more than frustration. It was quiet control, building slowly, methodically. I started imagining small acts. A misplaced garden hose just as he reached for it. Subtle changes in his bike tire pressure. Slight rearrangements of items in his apartment while he was gone. Little things that would make him pause, scratch his head, and wonder just for a second, did I do that? The satisfaction wouldn't come from anger. It would come from watching his perfectly ordered world wobble slightly, like a pendulum set in motion. I could feel my calmness sharpen, my focus intensify. I wasn't angry anymore. I was meticulous. And then one morning, the real opportunity presented itself. He had left the building in a rush, keys dangling from his hand, phone forgotten on the counter, music still blasting, and I realized I had access. Not to harm him, not to sabotage dangerously, but to remind him subtly that every action has a reaction. I paused, breathed, thought about timing. This would be the first true act in my plan, the opening move, the seed of the revenge I had been nurturing for months. I felt a strange mix of excitement and calm restraint. I knew the moment wouldn't last long. The window of opportunity was fleeting. And as I reached out carefully, executing the tiniest, most harmless shift, I felt it, the slow smile of justice forming. Not loud, not dramatic, not criminal, just quietly satisfying. Little did I know this first act, innocent to anyone else, would set off a chain of events that Dave couldn't possibly predict. A subtle web was being spun, and I was at the center, calm, patient, and ready. After that first subtle nudge, the tiny rearrangement, the harmless shift, I felt a calm satisfaction that I hadn't expected. It wasn't gloating, not really. It was more a sense of balance returning, like finally seeing the scales tilt just a little. I kept watching him, as always. His routine was predictable. That was both a frustration and a gift. He had no idea that I was paying attention, that every small misstep, every tiny moment of irritation was being carefully noted. The next morning, I made my move again. He had left his front door slightly ajar, rushing off to work, leaving his keys on the counter, his mail scattered in a small heap. The sunlight hit the kitchen just right, glinting off the stainless steel of his coffee pot. I noticed the way his cat stared at the window, tail flicking nervously. Perfect. I quietly adjusted a few things. Nothing that could cause harm, just tiny annoyances. The TV remote placed under the couch cushion, where he would have to dig for it. A slightly tilted picture frame on the wall. A glass of water on the counter, shifted just enough to leave a tiny ring on his favorite coaster. I stepped back and watched from the hallway. I wasn't rushing. There was no thrill from doing it quickly. The thrill came from knowing he would notice, slowly, imperceptibly, and wonder if his world was starting to misbehave on its own. Later that evening, I heard the footsteps in the hallway. Dave came home, carrying groceries, humming to himself, oblivious. I paused my breathing. He entered, set down the bags, and immediately paused. The TV remote wasn't where he left it. He frowned. The picture frame on the wall was slightly crooked, and there it was, the faint ring on his coaster. I could see him stop in the kitchen, tilt his head, mutter something under his breath, and start picking things up. I didn't intervene. I didn't reveal myself. I simply observed from my vantage point. And then it hit me. This is exactly what I wanted. Not confrontation, not anger, not drama, just him puzzled, questioning his own surroundings. Subtle, patient, quiet revenge. I started imagining larger, but still harmless scenarios. Little inconveniences that could compound over time. For example, planting tiny obstacles in his path, like a small garden hose where he wouldn't expect it. Slightly adjusting his bicycle tire pressure. Hiding his keys somewhere obvious enough that he would notice, but not so obvious that anyone else would suspect. I realized I was enjoying the process more than I should admit, but it wasn't about malice. It was about order, patience, and the satisfaction of subtle balance. And the more I watched, the more I understood Dave. He was predictable, yes, but he was also stubborn, careless, and delightfully unaware of his environment. Every quirk he had, every habit he took for granted, was a puzzle piece I could use. By the end of the week, I had quietly nudged the world around him in a way he couldn't ignore. A cup misplaced, a chair slightly off-center, a grocery bag that seemed heavier than it should have been. Nothing extreme, nothing obvious, but enough. I would hear him sigh, mutter to himself, or check his belongings twice. And each time I would smile quietly to myself, stepping back into the shadows, letting him stew in small confusion. This, I realized, was only the beginning. The first small acts had worked. I had set the tone. I had established the rhythm, and the rhythm was key. I started planning the next phase. The next steps needed to be even subtler, almost imperceptible, but impactful. Enough to make him think twice. Enough to create doubt without anyone ever noticing. And slowly, deliberately, I began mapping his week. His grocery trips, his TV habits, his garden care routines, even his morning coffee ritual. I wasn't stalking him, I was observing, silently, patiently. And I knew that when the time came, each small observation would be a thread in a web he wouldn't see until he was already caught in it. But patience was crucial. I reminded myself constantly, this isn't about speed, this isn't about drama, this is about precision. And for the first time in months, I felt in control. Not over him, not like a villain, but over the small annoyances, the little ripples, the quiet balance that had been missing from my life ever since he moved in. I leaned back, sipping my own coffee, thinking about the weeks ahead. And that's when the first real complication appeared. I noticed a new variable. A friend of his, a neighbor from across the street, had started watching him too. Suddenly, the quiet, private puzzle I had been building wasn't as private as I thought. The presence of another observer could complicate things, could disrupt the rhythm. I felt a small jolt of uncertainty, but also a thrill. This wasn't just a game anymore, it was strategy, planning, patience under pressure. And I was ready. The web was forming, but now, with a new observer in the mix, everything would become more complicated and more satisfying. I could feel the next move shaping itself in my mind, waiting for the perfect moment. The days that followed were deceptively quiet. Dave went about his life, still oblivious to the subtle shifts that I had orchestrated. And yet, I felt the tension building, not in the loud, dramatic way you'd see in a movie, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible way a clock ticks in an empty room. I kept my distance, watching him from my window, sipping my coffee slowly, letting each little annoyance settle into place before the next one was introduced. It started with the mailbox. I noticed he had a habit of leaving certain letters unfolded, stacked neatly on the counter. The next morning, I quietly opened the envelopes he had left near the kitchen window and rearranged them by size rather than by date. Small? Yes. Harmless? Absolutely. Impactful? More than he would ever admit. By the time he walked into the kitchen, he paused, squinting at the letters, muttering under his breath. I smiled quietly behind the curtain. The garden was next. Dave prided himself on his roses. Every morning, he would inspect them carefully, adjusting the leaves, trimming stray petals, fussing over every stem. I began moving small garden tools around when he wasn't looking. A rake slightly off-center. A watering can leaning against the fence instead of the shed. Little things, invisible to anyone else, but glaringly obvious to him. And it worked. He became slower, cautious, almost paranoid in his own space. I could see it in the way he hesitated before sitting down, checking twice before opening doors, glancing at the placement of chairs as though the room had suddenly become unfamiliar. It was subtle, yes, but the small victories fueled me. I didn't feel triumphant in a cruel way. I felt satisfied, like setting a complicated puzzle into motion and watching the pieces click together. Then came the unexpected variable. The neighbor from across the street, Mark. I had noticed him watching Dave a few times, lingering at the corner of his driveway or pausing near the fence. I didn't know his intentions, but his presence changed the dynamic. I had been the only observer, silent, patient, precise. Now there was a second pair of eyes, unaccounted for, unpredictable. I felt a flicker of uncertainty. Mark wasn't an enemy, exactly, but his attention could disrupt the rhythm I had cultivated. He could accidentally alert Dave, interfere with the delicate balance I had worked so hard to achieve. So I began adjusting my approach. I started using Mark's presence to my advantage, guiding him subtly without him realizing it. I would place objects in his knee of sight, tools, chairs, even the newspaper, so he might comment or inquire, drawing him closer to the tension I was building. One morning, I overheard him talking to Dave from across the street, casual remarks about the lawn, the mailbox, the garden. Dave's frown deepened as he responded nervously, unaware of my involvement but clearly feeling the pressure. I realized then that the web I had begun to spin wasn't just about Dave, it was about the environment around him. The small ecosystem of neighbors, friends, and routines that made him comfortable. Disrupting that ecosystem quietly, gently, was the real art. By the middle of the week, the subtle changes compounded. The TV remote would vanish for a few minutes every evening. A small pile of shoes would appear slightly misaligned on the mat. A coffee mug left on the counter would be slightly farther from its usual spot. Each minor shift added tension, feeding the invisible strain. And I was careful to retreat after every move, leaving just enough space for him to question himself without realizing anyone else was involved. Late one night, I stood at my window, looking out over the quiet street. Dave was pacing near his front door, glancing at the garden, the mailbox, the oddly shifted objects, muttering under his breath. Mark had gone home, leaving him alone, and yet the impact lingered. I realized something important. The real power wasn't in action, it was in patience. In watching him internalize the confusion, slowly, day by day. That's when I understood why revenge works best when it's invisible, when the target never suspects the force guiding the events. And as I sipped my tea, reflecting on the subtle chaos I had orchestrated, I began to plot the next phase. It had to escalate, but only just enough. Enough to create genuine doubt, a mild sense of paranoia, without ever crossing into cruelty. That line was crucial. That line would determine whether my revenge felt earned, clever and satisfying, or petty and reckless. I studied the patterns. His grocery runs, his newspaper habits, the way he left his car keys, even the cadence of his morning routine. Every detail mattered. And then, unexpectedly, the perfect opportunity arrived. A small delivery mistake, an extra package left on his porch, clearly not his, from a store he hadn't ordered from. His cat knocked over the box, scattering packing materials everywhere. He cursed softly, looking around in confusion, and that's when I realized the stage was set. It was time to integrate this accident into my quiet campaign. Carefully, subtly, it would become another thread in the web. And once that thread took hold, the unraveling would feel inevitable to him, though I would never appear in the picture. I leaned back, a slow smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The puzzle was coming together. And then, as if on cue, a neighbor's car door slammed across the street, startling Dave into dropping a small plant pot. That minor disruption, seemingly random, was exactly the kind of chain reaction I needed. I knew the weeks ahead would be delicate. Patience, observation, subtle adjustment. Every detail, a calculated ripple. Every ripple, a small nudge toward the psychological tipping point. And I was ready. The stage was set, the threads were weaving together, but I sensed something unexpected was about to test my patience and my subtle plan. One wrong move, and the carefully balanced web could wobble or snap. The following morning, I woke early, as usual, with the sun casting long streaks of light across my kitchen floor. I made my tea slowly, savoring the silence. The street outside seemed calm, almost ordinary, but I knew better. The subtle changes I had orchestrated over the past weeks were beginning to converge, and today I was going to witness the first visible reaction. Dave stepped outside, coffee in hand, his eyes scanning the yard with the kind of meticulous focus that now made him almost comical to watch. I leaned against the window, careful not to breathe too loudly. The mailbox caught his eye first. The letters had been rearranged, again, but this time one was slightly protruding, its corner bent just enough to be noticeable. His frown deepened. He touched it lightly, then stepped back, muttering something inaudible. I couldn't help but smile. From there, he moved toward the garden, his steps measured. He glanced at the rake I had shifted the night before, then at the watering can. His brows knit together, a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch in his jaw. He lifted the watering can, tilted it, and then set it back down in the original spot, but his hand lingered longer than necessary. The cat, which had become an unintentional accomplice, brushed against his legs. He startled, spilling a small puddle of water from the can onto his shoes. A small curse escaped his lips. I took a slow sip of tea. The tension was building. It wasn't dramatic, not in the sense of a confrontatio or shouting match, but the quiet disorientation in Dave was far more satisfying than any argument could have been. This was psychological, subtle, and deeply personal. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. He opened the small package that had been accidentally delivered days before. As he rifled through the contents, his confusion was obvious. None of it belonged to him, and yet, instead of calling the store or shrugging it off, he hesitated. He looked around, glanced toward my window, and for a split second, I saw that flicker of self-doubt, the seed of paranoia taking root. It was beautiful in a quiet, almost cruel way. I knew the next phase required patience. I had to let him stew, to allow him to question the sequence of events without ever suspecting that I was behind them. Every reaction, every hesitation was a small victory. By midday, his usual confidence had begun to waver. I observed him pacing near the fence, glancing at the mailbox, at the garden, at the misplaced objects I had subtly rearranged. His frown was now permanent, etched into his features. He muttered to himself frequently, and I noticed his steps had slowed. He was thinking too much. I reminded myself that this was not about cruelty. It was about precision, observation, the art of influence without visibility. That evening, I decided to plant another small trigger. Dave had a ritual of leaving a single chair perfectly aligned on the porch, as though the universe demanded order. I nudged it slightly out of place after he went inside to grab dinner. The shift was minor, barely perceptible, but I knew he would notice. And sure enough, 5 minutes later, he stepped out, squinted, then moved it back with exaggerated care, muttering something under his breath. It was the first time I saw genuine frustration, not anger, not rage, but the quiet recognition that things were subtly wrong. The satisfaction was undeniable, but I also sensed something unexpected, a spark of curiosity, a small awareness that maybe, just maybe, there was an external influence at play. I smiled, perfect. The web was beginning to weave itself tightly. Later that night, I journaled quietly in my study, reflecting on the day. Every detail mattered. The way he walked, the pauses, the muttered curses. Each minor victory added to the cumulative effect I had been cultivating, and the psychological momentum was shifting. The first real reaction had occurred, and it was exactly as I had hoped. Restrained, human, and utterly unaware of the true architect behind it. But there was also a subtle danger. Dave was starting to notice patterns, faint as they were. He could become hyper-aware, potentially ruining the natural flow I had worked so hard to create. That required careful observation over the coming days, more patience, more timing, more subtle nudges. I went to bed with a sense of calm anticipation. Revenge, I realized, was not a single dramatic act. It was a series of invisible threads, carefully placed, patiently observed, and quietly appreciated. Tomorrow, I would escalate just a little. Not too much, just enough to keep the psychological pressure mounting. And by the end of the week, I knew he would begin to unravel in ways that would feel entirely natural to him, though entirely engineered by me. The first reaction had occurred. Dave's perception of reality was starting to shift. But little did he know, the most surprising twist, the one that would make him truly question everything, was just around the corner. The morning sunlight crept through my curtains, painting soft lines across the floor, but the serenity inside my apartment stood in stark contrast to the tension I had orchestrated just outside. From my vantage point, I could see Dave stepping onto his porch, coffee in hand, his movements more measured than usual. The previous day's subtle disturbances had left a mark. I could see it in the slight hesitation in his stride, the brief pause as he surveyed the yard. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the silence stretch. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he was already reacting, almost instinctively, to the things he couldn't quite explain. I had prepared another small nudge for today. Nothing overt, nothing that would raise suspicion. Just tiny, almost imperceptible tweaks. A garden hose slightly coiled instead of neatly hung, a wind chime moved an inch off its usual alignment, the patio umbrella slightly askew. Each change was tiny, almost meaningless on its own. But cumulatively, they were starting to create a sense of disarray, a mild unease, the kind that gnaws at a person slowly. I noticed his hand twitch when he saw the hose. He muttered under his breath, a quiet frustration escaping him. The umbrella caught his eye, and he straightened it, but then glanced around as if expecting someone to be watching. His paranoia was mild but growing, the perfect reaction. I reminded myself, this was the essence of subtle revenge. It wasn't about shouting or confrontation. It was about psychological disturbance. Making him question his surroundings, his perception, his own meticulous control over his environment. By mid-morning, he had begun pacing in his yard. The mail was already delivered, but he opened and closed the mailbox repeatedly, adjusting the letters minutely. I caught myself smiling. It was almost mesmerizing to watch him unravel, step by step, without realizing that it was all orchestrated. The cat added to the chaos, brushing against his legs at the wrong moments, almost theatrically. Dave flinched each time, mumbling incomprehensible words. That little animal had become an unwitting accomplice, and I let it continue. I spent the afternoon documenting everything in my journal. His reactions, the slight furrows of his brow, the tone of his muttered curses. Every detail was important. Every response was a clue for the next phase. Then came the small package. I had left it near the porch the day before, making sure it looked accidentally misplaced. Dave approached it cautiously. I watched his face as he lifted the item, a pair of gardening gloves that weren't his, a set of postcards from a place he had never visited. He opened them, confusion clear in his expression, and for the first time, he glanced toward my window, scanning for signs of an observer. The satisfaction was quiet, almost imperceptible. The revenge was not about humiliation, it was about control. I was weaving a narrative he didn't realize he was a part of, slowly tugging at threads he didn't even know existed. I retreated inside, making a cup of tea, listening through the thin walls. The rhythm of his muttering became clearer. The worry, the curiosity, the subtle self-doubt, all of it feeding the pattern I had created. Later, as evening approached, I prepared the next move. This time, it was auditory. A soft creak from the fence where I had subtly loosened a hinge. A sound that would occur only when he was near, drawing his attention and making him wonder if the neighborhood itself had shifted overnight. And it worked. Within minutes, I could see him investigating the fence, his hand brushing along the wooden planks, scanning for evidence, shaking his head. His movements were precise, cautious, hesitant. The psychological pressure was building. I leaned against the window frame, breathing slowly. The beauty of subtle revenge lay in patience, in observation, in the quiet thrill of knowing that the person had no idea it was coming. Every reaction, every pause, every flinch was a small confirmation that the strategy was working. By nightfall, Dave's posture had shifted. His shoulders slumped slightly, his gaze darted more frequently toward the house next door. He wasn't angry, at least not yet, but he was unsettled. The slow psychological tightening had begun. As I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I realized something important. Revenge isn't about dramatic flair. It's about the accumulation of tiny moments that erode confidence, that make someone question the ordinary. And tomorrow, I would escalate just slightly more. Just enough to deepen the tension without making the manipulation obvious. The first real wave of discomfort had been achieved, and the anticipation of the next stage was almost intoxicating. Revenge, I reminded myself, was an art, and patience was the brush. Dave's unease was growing. Small things that seemed insignificant to anyone else were now shaping his reality. And tomorrow, the subtle escalation would push him further toward the breaking point. The next morning, the world felt quieter than usual. Even the birds seemed to tread lightly, as if sensing the tension that had begun to fill the air. I watched from my kitchen window, a steaming mug in hand, as Dave stepped outside. There was a difference in his gait, hesitation, a sort of nervous energy that hadn't been there before. He glanced around as if the entire neighborhood had shifted overnight. I had planned today carefully. Each action was calculated to push him just enough to make him question his environment without alerting him to the orchestration. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dangerous. It was psychological nuance, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. First, the garden. The hose was slightly tangled in a new way, a flower pot shifted just a few inches, the wind chime hanging at a barely perceptible crooked angle. He noticed immediately, adjusting each item multiple times. Each correction was meticulous, almost ritualistic. I could see the tension building, the silent frustration mounting. Then came the sounds. Soft, subtle noises that might have been dismissed by anyone else, creaks from the fence, a faint thud near the mailbox, the cat brushing against the porch boards just slightly off rhythm. But to him, they were signals of disorder. He paused, scanning the yard, muttering under his breath. I reminded myself the beauty of revenge was subtlety. The thrill lay not in spectacle, but in observation, in watching someone unravel in slow, almost imperceptible increments. By mid-morning, I introduced the next layer. The misplaced items. A gardening glove here, a misplaced book there, things that seemed insignificant but disrupted his carefully maintained sense of order. He picked them up, rearranged them, then stepped back, frowning. He muttered something about losing track of what's mine. I smiled quietly to myself. That was exactly the reaction I wanted. The psychological pattern was taking shape. Each small disruption compounded on the last, creating a sense of unease that grew as the day progressed. I could see him scanning my window, glancing toward my door, as if expecting someone to be watching. Little did he know, the only thing observing was the slow, patient eye of someone who had learned restraint, observation, and the quiet art of patience. I prepared the auditory trigger for the afternoon. A subtle rapping sound on the fence where I had loosened a plank the day before. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to catch his attention. Dave approached cautiously, his hand brushing along the wood, inspecting for irregularities. His movements were measured, almost hesitant, a marked change from his usual confident routine. While he investigated, I noted his reactions in my journal. Every flinch, every subtle shift in posture, every pause, all of it mattered. This was a mental map of his stress, a guide for the next subtle adjustments. By evening, I decided to escalate just a touch further. A faint scent of soil, recently turned, wafted from a spot in the yard where I had discreetly planted some herbs earlier in the week. Nothing intrusive, nothing overt, but enough for him to notice the change and wonder how it had happened. He stopped mid-step, sniffed the air, and his brow furrowed. The micro-frustration was building into real agitation. Dinner time came, and he retreated indoors, closing the blinds with slightly more force than necessary. I imagined him sitting there, replaying the day in his head, trying to make sense of the small inconsistencies. And that was the goal, not chaos, but mental engagement, questioning, self-doubt. I lingered at my window, sipping tea, savoring the subtle control. The cat curled at my feet, a silent accomplice, and I could hear the faint hum of the evening settling over the neighborhood. Dave's movements had slowed, his confidence quietly chipped away by a string of minor disturbances. As night approached, I prepared the final touch for today, a shadow slightly out of place. A planter I had moved only a few inches earlier now cast a different silhouette in the porch light. The moment he saw it, he froze. I imagined the thought crossing his mind. Am I imagining things? Has something changed here overnight? That was exactly where I wanted him, caught between certainty and doubt. I retreated from the window and wrote a few lines in my journal. Revenge, I realized again, was patience embodied. It was not about spectacle or confrontation, but the quiet thrill of subtle influence, a mental chess game played with patience, observation, and strategic nudges. Dave's unease was no longer subtle. He was beginning to question his routines, his environment, even his own memory. Tomorrow, I planned the next phase, something that would make him reconsider his control entirely without ever suspecting me. The following morning, the sunlight spilled across the neighborhood in the same calm way it always did, but I noticed something different in the air. Even from inside my kitchen, I could feel the tension seeping through the walls. Dave emerged from his front door, eyes scanning as though the yard itself had shifted while he slept. He moved cautiously, each step measured, his hand brushing against objects he'd normally ignore. I had spent the night planning the next subtle phase. Each action needed to be barely perceptible but psychologically powerful. Today, it would be a combination of auditory and visual triggers, things that he would see and hear, but that seemed almost coincidental. The key was layering them, letting his mind fill in the gaps. I began with the garden again. Not drastic changes, just micro-adjustments. A slightly tilted chair, a broom handle nudged a few inches, a garden gnome turned to face a different direction. Each tiny change might seem trivial, but to someone who thrived on order, it was enough to spark doubt. I watched through my blinds as he noticed, his brow furrowing, muttering softly under his breath. Next came the auditory layer. I had spent a few evenings before subtly setting up the creaks in the porch floor, loosening one board ever so slightly. Now, I tapped it lightly from inside my own house at unexpected moments. Dave would pause, tilting his head as if listening for a sound that shouldn't exist. The slow realization that something was off settled over him, and I knew it had the desired effect. At noon, I introduced a faint, almost imperceptible change to the scent in the air. Some freshly baked bread I had left cooling in the kitchen subtly wafted outside through the slightly open window. It was a smell he associated with comfort, yet today it was fleeting, teasing him from a distance he couldn't quite reach. He stopped mid-step, sniffing, his movements tentative. Even the small things mattered. By mid-afternoon, I set my next layer into motion, the illusion of misplacement. I had moved a small stack of his mail ever so slightly when he wasn't looking. Nothing was missing, nothing damaged, but the subtle discrepancy forced him to pause longer than usual. He reached down to straighten it repeatedly, muttering, "Did I put this here?" Each repetition deepened the feeling that something had shifted in his world. I took a moment to reflect. Revenge, I realized, was a patient study in human behavior. It wasn't about dramatic acts. It was about creating a slow, creeping awareness that their environment was no longer entirely within their control. Every reaction, every hesitation, every muttered word told me I was moving in the right direction. The final touch for today was the auditory trigger in the late afternoon. I knocked a small pebble from my porch onto the pavement in a pattern I knew would catch his attention. He stopped, scanning the yard and street as if expecting someone to emerge. I could see his confusion growing, subtle at first, then more pronounced. By evening, Dave's tension had transformed into something heavier, unease. His movements were cautious, calculated, uncertain. I sipped tea at my window, noting each micro-expression, each slight hesitation. Even his glance toward my house carried a new caution, a wary anticipation. This was the culmination of weeks of subtle influence, patience, and observation. As night fell, I sat back, satisfied. Tomorrow would be the day I nudged him further, weaving in small signs that would make him question his own memory and perception. By now, the pattern had taken root, and I knew that he would begin to doubt even the most mundane aspects of his daily routine. The psychological web was in place. Dave had started to question his environment, his perception, and even his instincts. I could sense his mental tension nearing a tipping point. The next day, a small, well-timed nudge would push him to confront uncertainty in a way he had never experienced before. The morning arrived with a deceptive calm, sunlight spilling evenly across our quiet street. From my kitchen window, I could see Dave moving through his front yard, but today his steps were hesitant, deliberate, unlike the confident strides I had once noticed. something had shifted. The subtle interventions of the past days were beginning to accumulate, and I could sense that the mental tension I had been planting was now bearing fruit. I started the day with a small, almost imperceptible adjustment to his usual routine. I left my trash bins slightly out of place, just enough that he would notice them while walking to collect his own. A slight frown appeared on his face, his eyes scanning, rechecking the placement as though questioning his own memory. Every small action mattered. This was psychological pressure in its purest form, invisible to anyone but him. Later, I placed an item, a small, inconsequential garden tool, where he usually kept it but subtly moved by a few inches. It was nothing, really. But for someone who thrived on precision, it created doubt. I watched as he reached for it, paused, and then muttered under his breath, "Did I leave it here?" The hesitation, the micro-expression of uncertainty, told me that the mental fog I had been cultivating was starting to envelop him. By mid-morning, I introduced a tiny auditory cue, a faint creaking sound from my porch, perfectly timed with his routine. Dave froze mid-step, tilting his head, scanning for the source. He repeated the same movement twice, checking the yard and then looking at his own front porch as if suspecting that someone was watching him. Every twitch, every glance, every subtle sign of worry thrilled me because it meant my patient strategy was taking hold. Around noon, I moved on to visual triggers. I left my curtains slightly ajar, letting a thin streak of sunlight illuminate an object in the yard, an object he subconsciously associated with my presence. His eyes followed it instinctively, and I could see the mental gears turning, as if he was trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't even know existed. I paused and reflected. Revenge was no longer simply an act. It had become an exercise in control, perception, and patience. Each small adjustment, each imperceptible cue, was weaving a web that was now starting to confound him. He wasn't aware of it consciously, but subconsciously he was already responding, anticipating, doubting, questioning. By late afternoon, I added the final layer for the day, a sub. TLE scent shift. I placed a bowl of citrus peels near the edge of my porch, letting the smell drift gently toward his walkway. It was familiar, yet unusual in that context. Dave paused mid-step, inhaled deeply, and then looked around, almost as if trying to understand the origin. It was subtle, but the effect was undeniable. He was unsettled, and I could see it in the small, instinctive gestures. The way he adjusted his posture, the way he hesitated before touching objects, the way he glanced repeatedly toward my house. The final act for today was nothing dramatic, just a minor shift of his doormat, moved just a few degrees. As he walked over it, he noticed immediately, his eyes narrowing, lips pressed in a thin line. I smiled softly behind my blinds. Patience had done the work my hands never could. By evening, the tension in him was palpable. He moved cautiously, each step calculated, each glance deliberate. I knew he was beginning to doubt his own instincts and perception. The stage was set, and the mental unraveling had begun. Dave's small uncertainties were now building into an internal storm. Tomorrow, I would introduce the next subtle nudge, something that would make him question not just his environment, but his own memory. The question was, how would he react when reality itself seemed unreliable? The next morning arrived like any other, but there was an unmistakable weight in the air. I could feel it even before leaving my bedroom, an electric tension that made the day feel different. Dave was moving unusually cautiously. From my window, I noticed him hesitating by his own front door, glancing repeatedly toward my house, adjusting and readjusting his glasses, as if trying to focus through a fog he couldn't name. I had prepared a slightly more elaborate setup today. Over the past days, the minor disturbances, the misaligned doormat, the subtly shifted objects, the faint sounds, the scents, had all been conditioning him. Today, I would introduce the trigger that would make all of it coalesce into something undeniable. A small but impossible to ignore disruption in his carefully maintained routine. I stepped outside under the pretense of watering my plants, carrying with me a small, inconspicuous mirror I had positioned behind a garden bush. Its reflection would catch the sun at the precise moment Dave exited his house. He would see a brief glint, not knowing what it was, but instinctively registering it. As he stepped into the sunlight, I watched him freeze mid-step. His eyes widened slightly, lips parting as he blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. The effect was immediate. He hesitated for a few long seconds, tilting his head, scanning the yard, and then glancing nervously toward the street. Something inside him had shifted. My patient manipulations had reached a tipping point. The small uncertainties, the creeping doubts, and the minor irritations of the past week had compounded into a tangible sense of unease. He was starting to distrust his own perception. I smiled subtly, keeping my movements calm and ordinary. I didn't speak, I didn't draw attention. I let the moment breathe. In the silence, I could almost hear the internal dialogue forming in his mind, the questions, the hesitations, the self-reproach. Did I see that correctly? Am I imagining things? Later that afternoon, I introduced the second layer of today's subtle upheaval. I left a single, slightly crumpled note on my front porch. Sometimes, things are not what they seem. Nothing else, no signature, nothing overt. I placed it where the wind could move it gently if he approached from his walkway. When he finally noticed it, his expression shifted to something between confusion and mild panic. He crouched down to pick it up, turning it over in his hands as if the meaning might jump out at him. That evening, as he returned from work, I noticed him walking slower than usual, glancing repeatedly toward my house, his brow furrowed, his posture rigid. He didn't make eye contact with anyone on the street. I could see the mental strain beginning to manifest physically, shoulders tense, fingers gripping the strap of his bag, subtle twitching in his jaw. For the first time, he wasn't just annoyed, he was unsettled, and I realized that the careful layering of small disturbances was working. The psychological groundwork I had laid over the past week had started to produce results. I didn't need dramatic gestures, shouting, or confrontation. I only needed patience, observation, and calculated nudges. By nightfall, Dave was visibly preoccupied, questioning his environment and perhaps unknowingly his own memory. Tomorrow, I would escalate just enough to push him further, just enough to make him realize that the situation was beyond coincidence. The tension was building, and the first cracks in his composure were showing. The real challenge would be, could I push him without breaking the subtlety that made this revenge-ess? Oh, satisfying. The morning light filtered through the blinds, painting thin stripes across my kitchen floor. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the calm before the next subtle storm. I had learned over the past weeks that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. Every minor disruption, every tiny ripple I had created, had been building toward something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. I watched him again from the kitchen window. Dave was outside, pacing along the driveway, muttering under his breath. He wasn't looking at me, but I could see the twitch in his shoulder, the way he adjusted his grip on his keys repeatedly, the short, shallow breaths that betrayed unease. Today, the plan was to push him slightly further without ever showing that I was behind it. I started with something innocuous, the garden gnome. It had been slightly tilted for days, almost imperceptibly so, but I straightened it fully today. As he walked by, I noticed him pause, tilt his head, and glance suspiciously toward the gnome. The slight confusion flickered across his face. Why did it look different? I could see him mentally running through scenarios, trying to rationalize it. Then came the second nudge. I placed a small, folded note near his front walkway. You might be seeing things, or maybe not. Nothing aggressive, nothing accusatory. Just words carefully chosen to plant doubt. He noticed it immediately, picking it up with a furrowed brow, turning it over, scanning the words. His lips moved silently as if reading aloud in his mind. For a moment, he looked genuinely unsettled. By mid-morning, I had noticed something new, a hesitation in his steps, a pause when he looked toward my house as if expecting. What exactly? I couldn't say. That was the beauty of it. I didn't need to define it for him. His imagination was doing the work. My revenge didn't have to be violent or confrontational. It just had to exist in the margins of his perception, where uncertainty breeds tension. I continued my routine as usual, watering my plants, tending to small chores, letting everything seem normal. But behind that normalcy, the psychological pressure was mounting. He adjusted the blinds on his windows, glanced toward my property repeatedly, and muttered more under his breath. It was subtle, but it was there. He was beginning to question his environment in a way that he hadn't before. Later that afternoon, I added another layer, the faint sound of a misplaced object. I had left a small wind chime in my backyard the previous day, barely audible from the street. Today, I adjusted it slightly so it would ring softly whenever a breeze passed. It was just enough to be noticed, just enough to break the rhythm of his day. I watched as he paused mid-step, looked around, and muttered, "That wasn't there before." It was working. The mental strain was accumulating, unnoticed by anyone else, invisible to the casual observer. I wasn't doing anything illegal, anything cruel. I was simply orchestrating a series of subtle events that magnified his own anxieties, his overreactions, his obsession with order. And with each nudge, the grip of his irritation loosened, revealing a more vulnerable, human side of him. As evening approached, I prepared the final piece for today's psychological layering. A faint, almost imperceptible note slipped under his front door. "You can't control everything, can you?" The phrasing was perfect, ambiguous, harmless, yet deeply suggestive. I knew from experience that ambiguity is more powerful than direct confrontation. His mind would do the rest, filling in the gaps, questioning motives, doubting his perception. By nightfall, he was visibly preoccupied, hesitant, even jittery. I could see him pacing in his living room through the blinds, stopping periodically, staring at his surroundings with suspicion. He didn't know it yet, but the web I had been weaving over the past days was tightening. He was inside the cage I had built, yet he hadn't seen the bars. Tomorrow, I would introduce the moment that would make him confront reality, or at least, force him to face the consequences of his constant overthinking. Would he realize it was all orchestrated, or would his mind collapse under the weight of uncertainty I had created? The tension was reaching a new level, and the most satisfying part of revenge is often the waiting. The morning air was crisp, almost deceptively calm. I made my coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him through the blinds again. Dave had changed. The jitteriness from yesterday hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified. There was a twitch in his jaw, a restless energy to his hands, and the way he kept glancing toward my property, it was almost compulsive now. I smiled faintly to myself. Patience, I reminded myself. Revenge is never immediate. The smallest gestures, carefully timed, can unravel even the most composed person. I stepped outside, under the pretense of watering my plant. As sunlight glinted off the leaves, and I made sure my movements were slow and deliberate. I wanted him to notice, wanted him to catch every subtle action and overthink it. The garden hose hissed softly as I adjusted the water stream, and I could see him pause mid-step on his driveway. He wasn't sure whether to approach, retreat, or simply watch. That hesitation, fleeting as it might be, was exactly what I wanted. A soft breeze stirred the wind chime again. The delicate tinkle carried across the street just enough to make him flinch. He turned sharply, scanning the surroundings as if expecting someone or something to be there. I didn't move. I simply smiled faintly, pretending to be absorbed in my plants. By mid-morning, I decided it was time for a more direct, though still subtle, touch. I left a folded note on the edge of my mailbox. Some things are better noticed than ignored. The words were non-threatening, carefully chosen to plant doubt and reflection rather than fear. Within minutes, I saw him pick up the note, furrow his brow, and tilt his head slightly. That tiny pause, the moment his eyes darted to my house and back to the note, was a small victory in itself. I returned inside and settled by the window with my cup of coffee, watching him. He was pacing again, muttering quietly to himself, visibly unsettled. I wasn't rushing anything. This was the slow build-up, the quiet dance where every micro-moment mattered. Every uncertainty, every fleeting second of hesitation would accumulate into a larger shift in his perception. The turning point came just after lunch. I had invited a friend over under the guise of a casual visit, though the real intention was more strategic. My friend brought over a small, mundane package, something innocuous that I left sitting at the edge of the driveway. Dave saw it immediately. He froze, confusion written across his face. He stared at it, then at me, then at the driveway. I said nothing. I didn't even look at him. Moments later, he picked it up hesitantly. My friend casually commented, "Funny how things appear sometimes." The tone was casual, almost teasing, but the underlying suggestion wasn't lost on him. His face tightened, and he muttered something under his breath, clearly unsettled. I could see him questioning himself. Was that package there before? Who left it? Did I imagine it? By the afternoon, the cumulative effect of subtle disturbances, odd notes, and careful observations had taken a clear toll. He was hesitant, jumpy, unsure of his surroundings. His movements were cautious, his words clipped. And yet, he hadn't confronted me, nor had he realized the orchestration behind it. That was exactly what I wanted. A psychological tension that built without a direct confrontation. As evening fell, I prepared the next layer. A slightly louder tinkle of the wind chime and a soft, deliberate noise near the side gate. Nothing overt, just enough to be noticed. I knew he would pause, peer around, perhaps even question his own memory. That internal questioning, that slow, creeping doubt, was more satisfying than any shouted argument or direct conflict. I poured myself another cup of coffee and watched him, reflecting quietly on how human perception works. People are often prisoners of their own thoughts. By planting doubt carefully, I could manipulate a chain reaction without ever lifting a finger in anger. This was the beauty of patience, the subtle artistry of revenge that didn't rely on confrontation or cruelty. Tomorrow, I would take the subtle tension even further, nudging him toward the point where he would be forced to confront the reality of his own paranoia. Would he finally realize the truth behind the small disturbances, or would he unravel completely under the weight of his own overthinking? The suspense was reaching a peak, and the payoff of patience was almost within reach. The morning light came differently that day. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of quiet tension that wrapped itself around the neighborhood like an invisible fog. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, but I didn't water the plants or tend to the garden this time. I simply walked to the edge of my driveway, deliberately slow, letting the sound of my footsteps resonate across the empty street. Dave noticed immediately. He was outside, trying to rake leaves, but his movements were stiff, hesitant. He glanced toward my house more often than he glanced at his own work. Something was building inside him, a mix of anxiety, confusion, and the creeping dread of uncertainty. I pulled a chair onto the driveway as if casually sitting to enjoy the weather. The small gesture, the casualness, was deliberate. I wanted him to see me, to feel the subtle dominance of control. It wasn't about aggression, it was about perception. And perception, I knew, could be more crushing than any argument. Then I placed a second note, carefully folded, on the edge of the mailbox. This one read, "Not Eve. Rithing is as it seems, pay attention." Simple words, no accusation, no hostility, yet the effect was immediate. He froze mid-rake, eyes darting to the note, then to my house, then back to the note. His jaw clenched. I could see his mind spinning, trying to piece together the meaning, trying to decipher whether I was aware of his behavior, or worse, whether I knew something he hadn't admitted to himself. I didn't move. I sipped my coffee, tilting my head slightly to watch him. He tried to appear calm, pretending to continue his chore, but every motion was tense, careful, and deliberate. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel the shift in the air. He was no longer merely annoyed, he was aware of an invisible pressure. He was reacting to my patience, my control, my restraint. By mid-afternoon, the tension had escalated. I arranged a small, deliberate obstacle on the side of the walkway, just a garden gnome placed perfectly in the corner. Innocuous, almost comical, but he noticed. His eyes flicked to it repeatedly, and each glance was accompanied by a brief pause in his movement, a micro-frown of irritation, and a subtle muttering under his breath. It was then I realized the tipping point was near. All of the small actions, all the subtle notes, all the little disruptions were accumulating. He wasn't panicking, not yet, but he was unraveling slowly, piece by piece, and it was fascinating to witness. That evening, I decided to introduce a small social element. A neighbor I trusted came over, ostensibly to borrow some sugar, but really to make a casual comment about the funny little things happening around the block. Dave overheard the conversation, and his expression shifted instantly. He was caught between trying to appear unaffected and acknowledging that the oddities were indeed happening. I retreated indoors, leaving him to stew. I could hear the soft creak of his steps and the occasional muttered question as he paced. That night, the quiet was thicker than usual, almost palpable. I poured myself another cup of coffee, reflecting on the art of subtlety. True revenge, I reminded myself, is never immediate, never loud, and never forced. It grows quietly, invisibly, and strikes when least expected. By the next morning, something would shift completely. The accumulation of doubt, hesitation, and minor disruptions would force a confrontation, not by violence, but by the overwhelming psychological pressure I had carefully orchestrated. Would he finally speak, or would he retreat into his own confusion, unsure of what was real and what was orchestrated? Morning came with an unusual stillness. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. I stepped outside, carrying my coffee and a small notebook I had started keeping, tracking every minor annoyance, every subtle misstep, every reaction Dave had made over the past few weeks. It wasn't obsessive, it was methodical, a reminder of how the smallest details could accumulate into something greater. Dave was already outside. He didn't glance at me at first. His eyes were fixed on the sidewalk, pacing slowly, hands shoved deep into his pockets. But the tension in his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight, told a story louder than words ever could. He knew I was watching. He knew I had noticed. I made no sudden movements. I sat on the edge of the porch, letting the sunlight fall across my face, sipping the coffee with deliberate slowness. That pause, that casual composure, was deliberate. I wanted him to feel the weight of my calm. I wanted him to wonder what I was thinking, what I knew, and what I might do next. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, edged with frustration. "Did you leave these notes?" His tone was cautious, hesitant, but a tremor of fear, small, almost imperceptible, slipped through. I smiled faintly, tilting my head. "Which notes?" I asked innocently, though I had watched him read every single one. He opened his mouth to answer, but then closed it again, muttering something under his breath. The frustration was palpable now, mixing with a sense of confusion. The subtle pressure I had applied, the accumulation of minor annoyances and indirect manipulations, had started to crack the surface of his composure. I leaned back slightly, letting a silence stretch between us. Silence can be sharper than any words. Every moment I didn't speak, every glance I allowed to linger, intensified his discomfort. "Look," he finally said, trying to sound casual but failing. I don't know what you're doing, but it's weird." I shrugged lightly, keeping my expression neutral, almost bored. "Weird or unexpected?" I asked softly. "Sometimes things happen and we just notice them differently. Or maybe someone is paying attention more than you think." The effect was immediate. His eyes flicked to the mailbox, then to the gnome on the corner of the walkway, then back at me. He was processing, analyzing, trying to connect dots, and every pause only heightened his uncertainty. I took a deliberate sip of coffee, letting the warm liquid calm me while he wrestled with his own thoughts. This was the culmination of weeks of subtle orchestration. The minor notes, the gnome, the casual observations, the silent watching, all adding up. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, an awkward, nervous laugh. It wasn't humor. It was a defense mechanism, a way to mask the growing awareness that he was being subtly outmaneuvered. I didn't respond immediately. I simply watched. The quiet dominance, the patience, the calm observation. It was the kind of pressure that doesn't scream, but it builds, almost imperceptibly, until the other person begins to collapse under it. By mid-morning, the tension had reached a delicate peak. He was trying to act normal, trying to pretend nothing was happening, but every glance at my porch, every shift of weight, betrayed his inner turmoil. He didn't know if he should confront me more aggressively or retreat completely. Either choice felt impossible. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about petty annoyances anymore. The psychological space we had created between us had shifted the power balance entirely. The revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, and it wasn't obvious, but it was undeniably effective. By evening, he would make a decision, either attempt to regain control or step back entirely, uncertain of what I had planned next. And whatever he chose, it would reveal the true depth of the quiet, subtle strategy I had been cultivating. The day had barely started, but I could already feel a subtle shift in the air. Dave didn't acknowledge me at first when he came outside. He walked past my porch, pretending to be absorbed in some mundane task, but the tension in his shoulders and the way he kept glancing at me betrayed him completely. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the silence do most of the work. Silence was my ally. Every second I didn't speak, every pause I allowed was like a weight pressing down on him. He could feel it, even if he didn't consciously realize why. Then I saw it, a small change. The gnome he had always moved around the yard, apparently to assert his territory, had been placed slightly differently. Subtle, innocuous. But the way he adjusted it when he thought no one was watching told me he was aware of my subtle influence over him. He was responding, trying to regain some control, even if he didn't fully understand the psychological game being played. I stood up, casually stretching, and called out in a neutral tone, "Morning, Dave." He flinched slightly at my voice, then forced a tight smile. "Morning," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. That small interaction, those tiny gestures of discomfort, were exactly what I had been cultivating. Weeks of small annoyances, of indirect manipulations, and patient observation were now beginning to bear fruit. He was reacting, and that reaction, however small, was proof that my strategy was working. I watched him carefully. He started watering the plants, not looking at me but clearly aware of my presence. Every movement was deliberate. Every glance measured. It was almost theatrical, how someone could try to act normal while internally unraveling. Inside, I felt a mixture of calm satisfaction and restrained amusement. This was the subtlety of real revenge. It wasn't about confrontation or loud arguments. It wasn't about making him physically pay or humiliating him in front of the neighborhood. It was about planting the seeds of doubt, discomfort, and uncertainty, then watching them grow. By mid-morning, I noticed him checking his mailbox more frequently, as if expecting notes, messages, or some new signal from me. He didn't know what he was looking for, but the fact that he was looking at all was proof that the psychological pressure was effective. I took another sip of coffee and allowed myself a small, private smile. My revenge was no longer hypothetical. It was real, subtle, and ongoing. And the beauty of it was that he had no idea that I was the one orchestrating the discomfort he now felt so keenly. As the afternoon approached, he began to act increasingly cautious. Each movement seemed rehearsed, as though he was trying to anticipate my next step, my next observation. The very fact that he was thinking about me, about how he might adjust to my influence, was the true peak of subtle victory. I leaned back in my chair, letting him expend energy that didn't exist. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to act. His mind was now a chessboard, and every pawn he moved was influenced by my patient, calculated approach. By evening, Dave would take his first overt action, attempting to test the limits of my calm, my silence, and my subtle manipulation. Would he confront me, retreat, or unknowingly step into the next phase of my strategy. By the time evening rolled in, the sun was low, casting long shadows across our adjoining yards. Dave's movements had become more deliberate, almost performative. I could see him pacing, adjusting things in a way that suggested he was testing boundaries. For weeks, he had only responded subtly to my presence and minor manipulations. But tonight, he would attempt something bolder. I was sitting on the porch swing, a book loosely held in my hands, pretending to read, though every sense was alert. The wind carried the faint scent of cut grass from his lawn, and the faint scraping of tools echoed from his garage. Then it happened, a knock not on my door but on the fence between our properties, just one but purposeful. I didn't move immediately. I let the pause linger. "Hey," he called, voice slightly strained, "can we talk?" I set the book down carefully, letting my expression remain neutral. Neutrality was my weapon. I didn't want to give away any reaction. I stood slowly, walking to the fence. "Sure," I said softly. "What's on your mind?" His eyes flicked briefly toward the gate, then back at me. "Look, I think maybe we've been misunderstanding each other. Maybe there's been tension that could be resolved." He smiled, but it was tight, controlled. There was an undercurrent of unease, almost a tremor of fear beneath the surface. It was subtle, but I noticed. He wanted to feel in control, to guide the conversation, to assert dominance. But the power he sought had already begun slipping from his grasp. I leaned slightly on the fence, keeping my tone calm and unassuming. Misunderstanding? Perhaps. But I've noticed some things, small annoyances, repeated behaviors, patterns. It's curious how you always seem aware that someone is watching. I let the words hang in the air. The pause was important. It was almost a psychological mirror. I reflected his own unease back at him. Dave shifted slightly, clearing his throat. I don't know what you mean. I'm just trying to be neighborly. Maybe we can start fresh." I tilted my head, letting a faint smile touch my lips, just enough to keep him guessing. Start fresh, that could be interesting, but only if both parties are willing to reflect on past actions, don't you think? His jaw tightened imperceptibly. I could see the mental gears turning. He wanted to push forward, to dominate, but his mind was now split between wanting control and the creeping uncertainty I had introduced. The rest of the evening became a subtle dance. Each movement, each gesture, each pause carried meaning. He repositioned the gnomes, adjusted his watering patterns, and glanced at the fence more often than necessary. It was almost comical if it weren't so deliberate and carefully controlled. I realized then that the overt test, the knock, the voice, the attempt to talk, was nothing more than the first ripple of my carefully orchestrated plan. He had stepped into the arena I had built for him without even realizing it. And the best part, he didn't know the rules. As night fell, I retreated indoors, letting him believe he had achieved some semblance of engagement, some subtle victory. In reality, he had merely advanced me one step closer to the stage, where the next phase of subtle revenge would unfold. The next day, I would set into motion a chain of small events that would make Dave question his own judgment and awareness. The psychological game was about to escalate, but would he recognize it or continue to stumble unknowingly? The morning after our brief confrontation, I woke with a quiet sense of anticipation. Revenge isn't about chaos, it's about precision. Every small detail matters, every tiny ripple eventually contributes to the wave. Dave had already stepped into my arena, and now the game would escalate, though he still had no idea. I started with the first subtle sabotage. Nothing overt, nothing that could be traced back to me, just tiny, almost imperceptible nudges that would slowly unbalance his routines. I noticed his morning ritual through the window, coffee cup in hand, keys jingling, the same path to the mailbox he had taken for years. I moved a small garden statue by a few inches, enough that he'd notice, but only if he was paying attention. Just the faintest disruption. It was fascinating. Humans crave patterns. When those patterns are interrupted, even slightly, the mind starts to compensate. That compensation often leads to mistakes, frustration, and most importantly, self-doubt. By midday, I had arranged several more minor inconveniences. A hose subtly angled to drip on a corner of his porch, a garden tool shifted to a slightly awkward place, a window left slightly ajar so the morning breeze rattled it. Nothing obvious, nothing criminal, but cumulatively effective. I watched from my kitchen window as he emerged for the second time that morning. His eyes flicked toward the garden statue. A subtle frown creased his brow. He adjusted the hose, muttered something under his breath. These small moments, his confusion, his irrita, were more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. He was already reacting without realizing why. His mind was processing anomalies, trying to locate the source. Every glance he cast my way was layered with a mixture of suspicion and defensiveness, though I did nothing overt to provoke it. Then came the neighborly interaction that would mark the next phase of the psychological escalation. I left a small package by the shared fence, just a note, nothing threatening, simply phrased. Curious how things sometimes seem, slightly off, isn't it? It was playful, almost teasing, but it carried a weight. I wanted him to question himself, to ask whether he was imagining these disturbances. Would he see them as random, or would he begin to wonder whether someone was subtly orchestrating the small anomalies in his life? By evening, I could see it clearly. Dave's movements had slowed. He paused more often, reached for things twice. The subtle frustrations of the day were already adding up, but he had no one to blame. And the beauty of it, he didn't even realize that he was already inside the framework of my carefully structured plan. I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the faint shadows lengthen across the yard. Revenge, I reminded myself, wasn't about spectacle, it was about control. Psychological control. The slow unraveling of his confidence, the patient insertion of doubt and irritation. That was far more powerful than any shouted argument or visible retaliation. Tonight, I would plan the next series of disruptions. A pattern would emerge, but only if he was attentive. If not, the accumulation of these small disturbances would eventually lead him to question his own mind. And in that moment of internal chaos, the foundation for the bigger moves would be laid. By tomorrow, the subtle disturbances would escalate just enough to make him rethink every interaction with me, and he wouldn't even know it was deliberate. The psychological groundwork was set, but how far could I push it before he realized he was being played? The next morning, I woke to an unexpected thrill. I didn't need alarms, confrontation, or dramatic stunts. The smallest ripples had begun to create subtle waves. Dave emerged from his house later than usual. Something had clearly unsettled him overnight, though he didn't know why. His steps were hesitant, his usual confident stride replaced by careful, almost tentative pacing. The hose I'd repositioned yesterday had slightly shifted in the breeze. He froze mid-step, glanced at it, muttered under his breath, and moved it back. Twice. It fascinated me how small irritations accumulate in a human mind. The first misstep, the first moment of doubt, sets off a chain reaction. I could almost see the invisible lines of his mental map start to fray. Throughout the morning, I kept adding tiny anomalies. A newspaper misplaced by a few inches. A garden rake that had mysteriously moved. Even the wind seemed to conspire in subtle ways, brushing through the slightly ajar window, rattling the glass in a barely perceptible rhythm. By mid-afternoon, the cumulative effect became more apparent. Dave's face was tighter, his gestures more abrupt, his eyes darting toward the fence far more often. He began double-checking things he would normally ignore. The tiniest noise caused him to pause, hesitant, uncertain. And then it happened, a soft but unmistakable muttered question to himself. Am I imagining all this? Exactly. That was the moment I had been aiming for. The subtle seed of doubt planted in his mind had begun to take root. It was invisible, undetectable, yet undeniably powerful. Humans are fragile when they cannot trust their own perception, and the realization is exquisite. Later, I noticed him inspecting his mailbox 3 times before finally taking the letters out. Each movement was calculated, hesitant. Each glance at my side of the fence carried suspicion he didn't dare voice. I kept my composure inside, letting the silence do the work. No notes this time, no interactions, just quiet observation. Sometimes the most powerful manipulation comes not from words or actions, but from absence. By doing nothing, I amplified everything. In the evening, I casually stepped outside with a cup of tea. Dave saw me, froze, smiled awkwardly, and nodded. The tension was palpable. A single exchange of glances, and the psychological groundwork had been further reinforced. He would overanalyze that nod all night, wondering whether I was aware of his growing unease. That night, I reflected on the subtlety of it all. Revenge isn't always about loud victories. Sometimes, it's a quiet, invisible art, precision strikes delivered in slow, deliberate doses. The real power lies in watching someone unravel without realizing they are being guided. By tomorrow, his careful composure would begin to crack further. Small mistakes, slight hesitations, and tiny frustrations would escalate. Would he finally confront me, or would he sink deeper into confusion, unsure of reality itself? The following morning, I awoke early, quietly sipping my coffee as I observed Dave from the window. The subtle sabotage had begun to manifest in small, yet telling, errors in his routine. I had carefully planted these disruptions, but now they were doing their work without my intervention. He approached the mailbox, fumbling with the latch. Letters spilled onto the ground. Normally, he would have immediately regained composure, but not this morning. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to scoop them up. A newspaper, now out of order, crumpled under his fingers. He muttered to himself, a low, frustrated sound, as if questioning his own abilities. Each small mistake amplified his internal tension. I could see him pacing slightly, running his hands through his hair, glancing repeatedly toward my window. The tiny movements of the hose, the repositioned garden tools, the subtly ajar window, all of it had shifted the equilibrium he had so carefully maintained. Later, I saw him attempting to mow the lawn. He tripped over a garden hose that I had repositioned the night before, barely catching himself. No one saw this but me, yet it was precisely the kind of disruption I had intended. He shook his head, muttering words under his breath, frustration building quietly, invisibly. I couldn't help but smile inwardly. The brilliance of subtle revenge is that it doesn't need confrontation. It doesn't need anger or shouting. It works because it quietly erodes confidence, creates self-doubt, and forces the target to confront small, relentless obstacles. By midday, the mistakes began affecting his interactions with neighbors. A friendly wave, a casual greeting, he hesitated. A simple conversation about the weather became stilted and awkward. The disruption had begun to spill outward, subtly influencing his social interactions. The most fascinating part was how unaware he was of the source. He was entirely convinced these minor mishaps were random, as if the universe had conspired against him. But I knew better. Every misstep, every hesitation was part of a carefully orchestrated pattern. As evening fell, I prepared for the next stage. I had to balance patience with action. The psychological pressure was mounting, and the next subtle nudge had to feel organic, like fate, not intent. My revenge wasn't about dramatic flourishes. It was about the slow, invisible accumulation of stress, confusion, and doubt. By tomorrow, these small mistakes would escalate into something more noticeable, something that would finally force him to question whether this was just bad luck, or if someone was subtly orchestrating his life. By the next morning, the invisible pressure I had been applying to Dave began to show more clearly. No longer were the mishaps just minor irritations or subtle hesitations. They were becoming noticeable fractures in his composure. I watched from my window as he stepped outside. His usually confident posture was slumped, his movements jerky. The hose I'd subtly moved earlier had shifted again in the breeze, and his gaze locked onto it immediately. He muttered something under his breath, crouched, adjusted it, then stood up and shook his head, a faint crease forming on his forehead. The newspaper had again blown partially onto the driveway. Normally, he would have ignored it for a few hours, but now he approached it cautiously, carefully picking it up, his movements tight, deliberate, and almost ritualistic. The smallest disruptions had become triggers, and his mind was beginning to overanalyze every minor detail. Later, as I prepared a cup of tea on my porch, I noticed him trip slightly over a small garden tool that had been left just so. He cursed it under his breath, softly, but enough for me to hear. Then he froze, glanced around nervously, and scanned the surroundings as if looking for evidence that someone was deliberately sabotaging him. That glance, that pause, was the moment I had been waiting for. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He was beginning to recognize, however vaguely, that something was off. The slow accumulation of my quiet interventions had begun to weigh on him. As the day progressed, his mistakes and hesitations multiplied. He left the garage door slightly ajar after moving his car, forgot to secure the fence latch, and even managed to water my side of the garden accidentally. Every misstep was a subtle victory, a confirmation that patience, observation, and strategic nudges were far more powerful than confrontations or anger. The most interesting part of all of this was watching his interactions with others. Where he had once been assertive, now he second-guessed himself. Conversations that would normally flow naturally became awkward. A casual greeting to a neighbor ended with him stammering, gesturing unnecessarily, clearly trying to mask his internal tension. I realized that revenge, in its purest foe, RM is less about spectacle and more about influence. By the end of the day, Dave's confidence was fractured. He was still functional, still polite, but the invisible cracks in his behavior were evident to anyone observant enough to notice. And I, quietly sipping my tea, felt the first real sense of satisfaction. By tomorrow, the pressure would escalate further. The cracks would become obvious, forcing Dave to confront the reality that someone might actually be orchestrating these disruptions. The tension was about to tip from subtle to unmistakable. The following morning, I noticed a shift in Dave that went beyond small mistakes or hesitations. There was a tension in his movements, a subtle tremor in his confidence. He was beginning to anticipate mishaps before they even happened. Every step outside was calculated, almost paranoid. I watched as he approached the mailbox. His hands lingered over the latch longer than necessary, eyes scanning the surroundings. He muttered to himself again, a quiet murmur that was a mix of frustration and disbelief. A single dropped envelope made him jump slightly, an overreaction to a minor inconvenience, proof that my psychological pressure was working. Later, he watered his garden. The hose, once a minor obstacle, now became an object of anxiety. He recoiled slightly every time it twisted underfoot. The previously trivial disruptions had evolved into triggers, and he was slowly learning to expect trouble at every turn. His social interactions were deteriorating more rapidly. Neighbors who once saw him as confident and outgoing now noticed his hesitation, his stammering, his overly cautious gestures. Simple greetings were now met with awkward smiles or rushed nods. The subtle tension I had created was spilling over into his public persona, and I could see the internal battle in his eyes every time he engaged with someone. At home, he began double-checking doors, locks, and windows multiple times a day. I had subtly shifted a few items inside the house weeks earlier, nothing overt, nothing illegal, but now he was retracing steps, questioning himself. His environment had become unpredictable, and that unpredictability was slowly eroding his composure. By evening, I noticed that he was avoiding the driveway altogether. Tasks that once were mundane, like taking out the trash or fetching the mail, were now approached with visible caution and hesitation. The psychological impact of subtle, persistent disruptions was becoming more tangible. Sitting on my porch, watching him navigate these challenges, I felt the quiet satisfaction of patience. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about dramatic confrontation. It was about strategic influence, creating tiny ripples that collectively reshaped behavior and perception. And now, after weeks of careful observation and intervention, those ripples were beginning to merge into waves. Tomorrow would bring a new challenge, a moment where his accumulated stress would force him into an undeniable error, one that neighbors and friends could notice, and one that would finally make him question everything he thought he knew about control and luck. By now, Dave's nerves were frayed. His once proud swagger had dissolved into jittery caution. Even the neighbors noticed his unease, subtle gestures of hesitation, the way he double-checked his steps or avoided eye contact. I watched quietly from my porch as he approached the driveway. The small disruptions I'd carefully orchestrated, the misplaced garden tools, the subtly moved trash cans, the quiet tricks with his mail, had built into a pressure cooker of psychological tension. Today, he was about to snap in a way the entire block could see. He tripped over a carefully placed hose, muttering expletives under his breath, his face pale, hands trembling. I didn't laugh. I merely observed. Years of his minor annoyances had culminated in this moment. His pride, his composure, his self-assurance fractured. Inside, he fumbled with his mailbox, dropping letters, spilling envelopes. A friend waved from across the street, and he froze, unsure whether to acknowledge them. The world around him was becoming unpredictable, disorienting, and every little misstep now fed the sense that he had lost control. That evening, he sat in his living room, staring blankly at a wall. I could almost hear the thought process in his silence. Why is everything going wrong? Did I imagine it? Every small disruption had been carefully placed, and he had unwittingly handed me the tool of revenge, his own overthinking and paranoia. I realized then that revenge wasn't a single dramatic act. It was cumulative. Every small irritation, every tiny ripple of disruption had led to this quiet collapse. He wasn't embarrassed, he wasn't defeated by confrontation. He was undone by subtle human patience. Could he rebuild? Or was this the moment where his own behavior would force him to reflect, and maybe even regret everything? Days later, NGS settled. Dave still moved cautiously, but the tension had softened. I didn't gloat. I didn't confront him. Revenge, after all, was never about shouting victory. It was about quiet reflection, patience, and letting natural consequences unfold. I observed him from my porch as he watered his garden. There was still a flicker of unease, but also a new humility. He had been forced to slow down, notice details, and reflect on how small actions affect others. Neighbors began to notice the change too, not just in him, but in the dynamic between us. The petty annoyance, the constant friction had vanished. He was calmer, quieter, more self-aware. My revenge had worked not through dramatic confrontation, but through subtle guidance, patience, and human psychology. I smiled quietly to myself. The story wasn't about ruining him. It was about restoring balance, teaching a lesson in patience, perception, and awareness. The satisfaction was internal, reflective, and enduring. Sitting on my porch, sipping my coffee, I realized that revenge, when subtle and earned, leaves a mark not through pain or humiliation, but through transformation. And perhaps, somewhere inside, he would carry that lesson for the rest of his life. Subtle revenge can teach lessons more profoundly than confrontation ever could. Patience, observation, and strategic action can have more impact than aggression. The story ends on quiet introspection, with the audience left pondering their own reactions to small injustices.